A judge fined a royal guard for breaking protocol, confident he could make an example out of him. But the moment the guard revealed his legal expertise, it became clear the judge had picked the wrong man to challenge. Here's what happened next. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, at this exact time, we're releasing another powerful royal guard story you won't want to miss. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace like a shroud, and through it, Lieutenant Ivor Blackstone emerged from the guardhouse with the measured steps of a man who had learned that every movement carried weight. At 28, he had already served 3 tours with the household division. But it was his time before the military that truly shaped the man who now stood at attention in the iconic red tunic and towering bearskin hat. Before Blackstone ever picked up a rifle, he had picked up law books. The son of a Manchester factory worker and a school librarian, he had earned his way through Cambridge on a scholarship, graduating with honours in law. His professors had expected him to join some prestigious firm in the city, but Blackstone had different plans. He wanted to serve his country, not corporate interests. The military offered him something the legal world couldn't, a chance to stand for something greater than himself. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now stood guard over the very establishment he had once studied in dusty legal tomes. The Queen's Guard regulations weren't just memorized procedures to him. They were living documents that he understood in their historical context, their legal framework, their very soul. While his fellow guardsmen knew the rules by rote, Blackstone understood their purpose, their limitations, and most importantly, their flexibility in the face of human necessity. The tourists were already gathering despite the early hour, their cameras clicking incessantly as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the stoic guards. Blackstone had learned to ignore them, to let their chatter wash over him like white noise. His eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, scanning for threats while maintaining the appearance of immobility that the position demanded. But beneath that still exterior, his mind was always active, always processing, always ready. The palace gates gleamed in the strengthening sunlight, and the changing of the guard ceremony was still hours away. This was the quiet time, when the real work of standing watch began. Not the ceremonial pageantry that drew crowds, but the patient, invisible vigilance that kept the realm secure. Blackstone took pride in these moments, understanding that duty wasn't always glamorous, but it was always necessary. As the morning progressed, the crowd began to thicken. Schoolchildren on educational trips pressed their faces against the railings, their teachers struggling to maintain order while explaining the historical significance of the guards. American tourists wondered aloud if the guards were real or just actors, while European visitors showed more restraint, content to observe from a respectful distance. Blackstone had been at his post for nearly 2 hours when he first noticed the elderly woman. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair carefully arranged under a small hat, wearing a navy blue coat that had seen better days but was meticulously maintained. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who had known better times, and something in her bearing reminded him of his grandmother, a woman who had lived through the Blitz and never complained about anything life threw at her. The woman approached the railings slowly, not with the eager rush of a tourist, but with the measured steps of someone who had a personal connection to this place. She stood apart from the crowd, her weathered hands gripping the iron bars, as she gazed at the palace with eyes that held memories. Blackstone found himself wondering what she might have seen in her lifetime, what stories she could tell about the monarchy, about London, about the changes that had swept through this ancient institution. For 20 minutes, she stood there in quiet contemplation, occasionally glancing at the guards, but never with the intrusive curiosity of the other spectators. Instead, her look held recognition, perhaps even gratitude. It was the look of someone who understood what the guards represented, who valued their service not as a tourist attraction, but as a living symbol of continuity and protection. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant rumble of London traffic. Blackstone's training had taught him to process these sensory inputs without losing focus, to maintain awareness of his environment while performing his ceremonial duties. He noted the shift in the wind, the way the light fell across the courtyard, the subtle changes in the crowd's energy as more people arrived for the day's activities. It was 9:23 a.m. when everything changed. The elderly woman had been standing quietly for nearly an hour, and Blackstone had grown accustomed to her presence as a calming constant in the swirling chaos of tourists and photographers. She seemed to be gathering herself to leave, taking one last long look at the palace, when suddenly her composure cracked. The first sign was subtle, a slight sway, barely perceptible to anyone not trained in observation. But Blackstone caught it, his peripheral vision picking up the minute change in her posture. Then her grip on the railing tightened, her knuckles going white as she struggled to maintain her balance. The carefully arranged hat shifted slightly as she began to lean forward, and Blackstone realized with growing alarm that she was in distress. The crowd around her was oblivious, caught up in their own experiences, their cameras and conversations, creating a bubble of self-absorption that left the woman isolated in her moment of crisis. A group of teenagers pushed closer to the railings, jostling for position, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. A tour guide's voice droned on about architectural details, completely missing the human drama unfolding just meters away. Blackstone's training kicked in with mechanical precision. His eyes remained fixed forward, but every fiber of his being was focused on the woman whose distress was becoming more apparent with each passing second. Her breathing had become labored, visible in the cool morning air, and the color was draining from her face with alarming speed. Her left hand moved to her chest, a gesture that sent ice through Blackstone's veins. The regulations were clear. Guards were to remain at their posts, except in the most extreme circumstances. But what constituted extreme? The legal mind that had earned him his Cambridge degree began rapidly processing the relevant statutes, the precedents, the letter and spirit of the law that governed his actions. The Queen's Guard Code of Conduct, Section 12.4, flickered through his consciousness like a beacon in the fog of duty and protocol. The woman's knees buckled. For a moment, she caught herself on the railing, her body trembling with the effort of remaining upright. The teenagers nearby finally noticed something was wrong, their chatter dying away as they stepped back uncertainly. But no one moved to help, that peculiar paralysis of modern life, where people assume someone else will act, that someone else is more qualified, more responsible. The decision, when it came, was instantaneous. One moment Blackstone was the perfect statue of military discipline, and the next he was in motion, his ceremonial rifle secured, and his body pivoting with the fluid grace of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of crisis. The bearskin hat, normally an immovable part of his uniform, stayed perfectly positioned despite the sudden movement, a testament to the countless hours of drill and ceremony that had made such precision second nature. The woman collapsed just as Blackstone reached her, her body going limp as consciousness fled. He caught her with practiced ease, his arms supporting her weight as he lowered her gently to the ground. The crowd gasped and stepped back, creating a natural circle around the scene, their cameras forgotten in the face of genuine human drama. Medical training, a requirement for all guardsmen, took over. His fingers found the pulse point on her neck, weak but present. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, her skin pale and clammy. The symptoms painted a clear picture: cardiac event, possibly a heart attack, definitely life-threatening. Every second counted, and the nearest ambulance was minutes away, even in the best circumstances. "You there?" he called sharply to a young man in a Manchester United jersey who stood gaping nearby. "Call 999. Tell them we have a suspected cardiac event at Buckingham Palace, main gate. Adult female, approximately 70 years old, unconscious, weak pulse." His voice carried the authority of command, cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. The young man fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed. Blackstone began CPR, positioning the woman's head to clear her airway before starting chest compressions. The rhythm was automatic, drilled into him through countless training sessions. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat. His hands found the correct position on her sternum, and he began the steady, measured pressure that might keep her alive until professional help arrived. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the ceremonial guard transformed into a life-saving first responder. Some pulled out phones to record the extraordinary scene, while others simply stood transfixed by the sight of military precision applied to civilian emergency. The bearskin hat remained perfectly positioned throughout, somehow adding to rather than detracting from the gravity of the moment. The compressions continued with metronomic precision. Blackstone counted silently, his years of legal training helping him maintain focus even as adrenaline coursed through his system. He could hear the young man speaking urgently into his phone, providing location details and condition updates to the emergency dispatcher. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens suggested that help was finally on the way. A retired nurse in the crowd stepped forward, identifying herself and offering assistance. Together, they worked to stabilize the woman, the nurse taking over, breathing while Blackstone continued compressions. It was a testament to the fundamental humanity that could emerge in crisis. Strangers working together with a shared purpose that transcended all other considerations. The woman's color began to improve slightly, and Blackstone felt a flutter of hope. Her pulse strengthened marginally, and her breathing, while still labored, became more regular. The CPR was working, buying precious time until the paramedics could arrive with their advanced equipment and medications. It was during this crucial moment, as Blackstone knelt on the cobblestones with the woman's life literally in his hands, that Judge Lawrence Montgomery chose to make his entrance. The man who would soon prove to be an expired authority figure pushed through the crowd with the bluster of someone accustomed to deference, his voice booming across the courtyard like a foghorn in a peaceful harbor. Montgomery was a man in his mid-60s, with the kind of jowly face that suggested too many rich meals and too little physical activity. His suit was expensive but ill-fitting, and his manner had the theatrical quality of someone who had spent too many years performing for courtroom audiences. He carried himself with the exaggerated dignity of minor authority, the kind of person who had never quite achieved respect he felt he deserved and compensated with volume and bluster. The paramedics arrived just as Montgomery began his tirade, their professional efficiency immediately taking over the medical situation. They worked with swift competence, checking vitals, administering oxygen, and preparing the woman for transport. Blackstone stepped back to give them room, his duty as a first responder complete, ready to resume his ceremonial role. But Montgomery had other plans. As the ambulance crew worked to stabilize their patient, he positioned himself for maximum dramatic effect, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the practiced projection of a man who had spent years commanding attention in legal proceedings. "You there, soldier." Montgomery's voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" The crowd, which had been watching the medical emergency with respectful concern, suddenly found themselves with a new focus. Cameras that had been lowered out of respect for the unconscious woman now swung toward this new source of drama. Montgomery clearly relished the attention, his chest puffing out as he prepared to deliver what he obviously considered to be a masterful performance of judicial authority. Blackstone straightened slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. He had returned to his post and resumed the position of attention, but there was something different about his posture, now not the automatic stillness of ceremony, but the alert readiness of a man who recognized that a different kind of challenge was about to unfold. "You abandoned your post," Montgomery continued, his finger jabbing accusingly at the guard. "Dereliction of duty. Do you have any idea what the penalties are for such behavior?" The crowd began to murmur, their confusion evident. They had just witnessed a man save a life, and now he was being berated for it. The disconnect between what they had observed and what they were hearing created a tension that was almost palpable, a collective sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Montgomery seemed oblivious to the crowd's reaction, or perhaps he fed off it. His voice rose another notch as he continued his performance. "I am a Crown Court judge, and I will not tolerate this breach of protocol. The Queen's Guard exists to protect the realm, not to play at being medical personnel. Guards are to remain at their posts, no exceptions." The retired nurse who had assisted in the rescue looked stunned. A group of school children stared at the spectacle, their teacher struggling to explain what was happening. In the distance, the ambulance door slammed shut as the woman was whisked away to receive the advanced medical care that might save her life, care that might not have been possible if Blackstone had remained frozen at his post. Blackstone remained silent throughout Montgomery's tirade, his face a mask of professional composure, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his grip on his rifle. The man who had spent years mastering the art of stillness was now demonstrating a different kind of control, the discipline required to remain calm in the face of injustice. Montgomery pulled out a leather-bound notepad with theatrical flourish, his pen poised like a weapon. "I am fining you £5,000 for dereliction of duty," he announced loudly. ensuring that every word carried to the growing crowd. "And I will see to it that you face court-martial proceedings for this flagrant breach of military discipline." The crowd's murmur grew louder, more agitated. A retired Marine sergeant in the audience stepped forward, his face darkening with anger. "Bloody hell," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The man saved a life." Other voices joined in, a growing chorus of disapproval directed not at the guard but at his accuser. "He's a hero," someone called out. "This is ridiculous," shouted another. The tide of public opinion was clearly turning. But Montgomery seemed intoxicated by his own performance, deaf to the growing hostility of his audience. A young woman with a smartphone had been recording the entire exchange, and she now stepped forward with the righteous indignation of her generation. "This is going straight to social media," she declared. "Everyone needs to see this injustice." Montgomery's smile widened, mistaking the attention for approval. "Excellent," he said with satisfaction. "Let the world see what happens when military discipline is properly enforced. Perhaps this will serve as a lesson to others who might be tempted to abandon their duties." It was at this moment that Blackstone finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried with such clarity that even those at the back of the crowd could hear every word. The contrast with Montgomery's bluster was stark where the judge had been loud and theatrical. The guard was calm and precise. "Your Honor," Blackstone said, the title carrying just the faintest hint of emphasis, "may I cite regulation?" Montgomery's eyebrows rose, and his laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, this should be rich," he said, playing to the crowd like an actor delivering a punchline. "By all means, Lieutenant, enlighten us all with your legal expertise." The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Blackstone's eyes locked onto Montgomery's with the intensity of a laser sight, and when he spoke, his voice carried the precision of someone who had spent years mastering the art of legal argument. Section 12.4 of the Queen's Guard Code of Conduct, Blackstone began, his words measured and exact. "In the event of immediate threat to life or limb, a guardsman may temporarily abandon post to render aid, provided he resumes duty at the earliest possible opportunity." Montgomery's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Regulations can be interpreted in many ways," he blustered. "As a Crown Court judge, I have the authority to." "Furthermore," Blackstone continued, his voice cutting through Montgomery's objection like a scalpel through flesh, "you are not a sitting Crown Court judge. You retired 3 years ago following an ethics investigation into allegations of judicial misconduct and abuse of authority." The crowd's intake of breath was audible. Montgomery's face went through a series of color changes, from red to purple to an unhealthy shade of white. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. Blackstone wasn't finished. "The investigation," he continued with the relentless precision of a cross-examination, "centered on allegations that you used your position to intimidate witnesses, made inappropriate comments about defendants' appearances, and showed clear bias in your rulings. You were offered the choice between formal disciplinary proceedings and early retirement. You chose retirement. How could you possibly?" Montgomery began, his voice now lacking its earlier confidence. "The case was covered extensively in the legal press," Blackstone replied smoothly. "As someone with a law degree from Cambridge, I make it my business to stay informed about judicial proceedings. Your retirement was not the quiet, honorable departure you might have preferred." A phone camera captured Montgomery's face as the full reality of his situation began to dawn on him. The crowd, which had been murmuring before, was now openly hostile. The retired Marine sergeant stepped closer, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned his right to speak. "So let me get this straight," the sergeant said loudly. "This man saves a woman's life, and you're trying to punish him for it. And you're not even a real judge anymore." The crowd's anger was now palpable. What had begun as confusion and concern had transformed into something approaching mob justice. Montgomery found himself surrounded by faces filled with contempt and disgust, his theatrical performance having backfired spectacularly. "Which means," Blackstone continued, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel, "that you have no authority whatsoever to levy fines, threaten court-martial proceedings, or make any official pronouncements about military discipline. You are, in legal terms, a private citizen with no more standing in this matter than any of these tourists." Montgomery's notepad fell from his nerveless fingers. the expensive leather binding hitting the cobblestones with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. His mouth worked soundlessly, his face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and growing panic. In fact, Blackstone said, and there was now an almost conversational tone to his voice, your attempt to impersonate a judicial authority could itself be construed as a criminal offense. The Fraud Act 2006 specifically addresses false representation of official capacity. The young woman with the smartphone looked up from her screen with excitement. This is already going viral, she announced. #fake judge is trending. Montgomery's eyes darted around the crowd, searching for sympathy or support, and finding neither. The people who had gathered to watch the changing of the guard had instead become witnesses to a very different kind of spectacle, the spectacular downfall of a man who had tried to weaponize authority he no longer possessed. I may have overstepped, Montgomery mumbled, his voice barely audible. The retired Marine sergeant cupped his ear theatrically. What was that? Couldn't quite hear you. Blackstone's expression remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, not triumph, but the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Louder, sir, he said, his voice carrying the same crisp authority he had used to direct the emergency response. Montgomery's face crumpled. The theatrical bluster was gone, replaced by the deflated posture of a man who had been thoroughly exposed. I apologize, he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with none of its earlier confidence. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Several people shouted, "Good riddance," and about time. The retired Marine sergeant stepped forward and offered Blackstone a crisp salute, which the guard acknowledged with a slight nod before returning to his position of attention. As Montgomery slunk away through the crowd, his expensive suit looking somehow shabby and his shoulders hunched in defeat, Blackstone returned to his ceremonial duties with the same precision he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. The bed hat was adjusted to its perfect position, the rifle held at exactly the correct angle, the posture returning to the ramrod straightness that defined the Queen's Guard. But something had changed. The crowd no longer saw him as merely a tourist, attraction, or a living statue. They saw him as a man who had demonstrated the highest ideals of service, not the blind obedience of a automaton, but the thoughtful courage of someone who understood that true duty sometimes required breaking the rules in service of a higher purpose. The young woman with the smartphone approached the barriers one last time before leaving. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, for saving that woman, and for showing us what real authority looks like. Blackstone's eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, but those who watched closely might have seen the slightest softening around the edges, the barely perceptible acknowledgement of words well-spoken. As the crowd began to disperse, many of them pulling out their phones to share the story with friends and family, the normal rhythm of palace life began to reassert itself. Tour groups arrived, cameras clicked, and the eternal dance of ceremony and tourism continued. But the story of what had happened that morning would live on, spreading across social media and traditional news outlets, becoming a symbol of the difference between authority and power, between following orders and doing what's right. In the days that followed, the woman whose life Blackstone had saved would send a letter to the palace, expressing her gratitude and requesting that he be commended for his actions. The story would be picked up by news outlets around the world, becoming a touchstone for discussions about duty, humanity, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Montgomery, meanwhile, would find himself the subject of renewed scrutiny as journalists dug deeper into his past. The ethics investigation that had ended his career would be revisited, and several former colleagues would come forward with additional stories of his behavior. His attempt to humiliate a guardsman would instead become the final chapter in a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of accountability. But on that crisp October morning, as the sun climbed higher over London and the palace settled into its daily routine, Lieutenant Ivor Blackstone stood at his post with the quiet dignity of a man who had proven that sometimes the highest form of duty is knowing when to break the rules. The bearskin hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but beneath it, those who looked closely might have seen something that hadn't been there before: the calm satisfaction of a job well done, and the knowledge that when the moment came, he had chosen correctly. The palace bells chimed the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the courtyard and out into the bustling streets of London, where the story of the guard who saved a life was already beginning to take on the golden patina of legend.